Hey, everybody. This is Accelerating Value, the podcast that takes a look at value, right? And this is something that is not only in the eye of the beholder, it also has some real definitions around it as well. But those definitions vary from person to person and organization to organization. And so this is where every week we talk to somebody, either high and exalted or maybe just getting started in their career. We have some of those as well, and across not only marketing but many other disciplines inside of a company or an organization, about how do they see it? How do they see the value that they create? How intentional are they about it? Do they have a game plan? Do they have a business case? But even if that's the case, how do they define it? Right? How do they sustain it across time? And what is the value of their definition of value versus everyone else's definition of value? So there's just all kinds of stuff that we peer into, and the whole goal here is to showcase what our guests have to say about it, in the hopes that it will help you in your own quest to create value. So today we have a granddaddy of all guests, right?
Is this some sort of crack on my age? What?
No, not at all. Not at all. Let me. So Scott Brinker wears many hats, but one of them is the Godfather of Martech, right? So that's what I meant. Right. And
I'm not sure that's better, but we'll let that one slide.
So he runs product marketing at HubSpot. He has his hands in other pies as well, inside and outside of HubSpot. But a long time ago, what was that, like 12 years ago?
That started the blog, or that crazy landscape, or Yeah.
So something called Chief Marketing popped onto everyone's radar, and kind of the first, really memorable artifact, I think, if you go back and talk to 1,000 people, this is what they'll say, is a logo chart categorized by different categories of Martech and things like that, and that has over the years become steadily more and more dense. And has really documented the rise of Martech in corporations and the challenges. And I think that one of the things that you really do very well, Scott, is that part of your role is to be a cheerleader for Martech, but part of your role is also to throw some well-chosen rocks at Martech, right? And say, hey guys, these are challenges that are not being grappled with, or they're being grappled with incompletely, or whatever the case is, right? And I think that you have done that very, very well. And the reason why I say all that is that right there created a lot of value for a lot of people. So let me ask you to go back in time and say, when you first started Chief Martech, did you have a plan for the value that you wanted to create, or was this like something you just started doing and then it caught fire and then you started to understand how you were creating value and then you did more of that? How did you approach it?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I would say the Chief Martech thing started as a labor of love, and I've actually worked really hard to keep it as a labor of love. So the work I do professionally, before I joined HubSpot, I was the co-founder and CTO of a SaaS company myself. The work I do at HubSpot with growing their platform ecosystem. Don't get me wrong, for all of those things, I have a very clear set of objectives, like a strategy, looking at, how we create value. With the Chief Martech stuff, because it started as a labor of love, I was just fascinated by this entanglement that was happening between what had started as two disciplines on the opposite end of the career spectrum, IT and software development and marketing. wow, if these two groups ever met in the hallway, they wouldn't even recognize each other, you know. But yeah, it was clear, you know, over the past decade, 2 decades. I mean, these communities were entangling. They were creating new kinds of professionals. They were changing the way the organizations work. I was just fascinated by that. And so kind of my guiding principle from the beginning with Chief Martech was do things that I find really interesting. And one of the ways I learn things and figure them out in my own head is to try and explain them to other people. And the fact that, yeah, now other people, you know, have gotten some value out of that, I'm incredibly gratified by. But yeah, it's mostly like, okay, well, that sounds like maybe then the explanation I got in my head. Maybe that's some positive feedback that, okay, maybe that is the explanation for it. So,
do you see? So actually, this was a question that that someone we both know asked me to ask you in this interview. That's Sangram, by the way. Do you see yourself? And I know this sounds like a loaded question, but it's really not meant that way. Do you see yourself as an arbiter of Martech's value?
I don't think I'd put myself in the arbiter position. That's a pretty lofty position to have. I'm not sure anyone is the arbiter in like a universal sense. I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is who's the arbiter of value in individual companies. You know, who are the people who are raising their hand and taking responsibility for how do I make this stuff deliver real value to our customers, to our organization. And to be honest, it's actually one of the reasons why you know, don't get me wrong, I really love this stuff, I enjoy it, but I'm always sheepish about somehow being the representative of this industry, because the truth is, I'm not a marketing operations person. I don't even play one on TV. You know, the people who I look at as I think as the real heroes are the people I talk to who they are leading marketing operations in these organizations. They're struggling with these challenges of how do they deliver value? How do they represent that value? So no, I'm not not an arbiter. Maybe an advocate. Does that?
Sure. Yeah. No,
armchair analyst. Does that work?
Yeah. No. Absolutely. And I think that so what I said to Sanger about that was, you know, I've never seen Scott do a review. Right. Even at the category level. Right. I've never seen you like say, well, this is my top 10 or my top 5 or whatever. Right. You're more of an analyst of sorts, pointing a spotlight onto different issues rather than different companies.
Yeah, part of that is also my. I think it's kind of just a humility in the fact that there's so much happening with so many companies, so many innovators. I mean, this whole landscape that just keeps growing at such a expansive rate. To be honest, I'm always a little bit skeptical of people who claim to be able to be the arbiters of these, in broad, because there's just so much going on, and like which solution is right for which company depends an awful lot on the particulars of the company that's adopting that solution. I know we come from a world in the classic analyst space where there's these grids of like, okay, there are 6 players in this space, and here's how we map out these 6 players. And there was a time where I think that way of framing it was actually reasonably effective. But in today's world, where there's just so many things, they're so interoperable, and people are customizing things, they're adding their own pieces. I think it's very difficult to somehow be like a universal, judge.
Oh, yeah.
Of like, okay, this is the category, these are the 3 companies, done. But not to take anything away from someone who's actually doing that, is great at it. I guess I'm just very cognizant of the fact that I'm not smart enough to be able to do that.
I think that's right on. So let me ask you this question. a lot of things changed in the last 14 or 15 months, right? One of them was, and we see this at Proof with customer data spanning like 2019, 2020, and now into 2021. There's just literally no, it's all important. The historical data is important to what's going on right now, but the amount of volatility and the velocity of change that's represented in that roughly 30-month period, right, is huge, right? And so what everybody has kind of figured out to some degree, ex post facto for the most part, is what was working before isn't working now. That poses challenges for people, process, technology, right? And the way that all that kind of links up. How do you see this issue specific to Martech? Because it's way beyond Martech, right? I mean, you can read about CHROs having exactly the same conversations, right? I mean, it's everywhere, right? So how do you see kind of not necessarily the change in the products, okay, but the change in the way that those products are being used today to sort of pierce the veil on this problem?
Yeah, it is a fascinating challenge. I feel like this is, we're living in such a, Dickens state of like the best of times and the worst of times. I mean, it's amazing so much of what's innovating. The fact that we have the opportunity at this point in time to help be a part of this change and, shape, this future of business. Yeah, it's an incredible opportunity, but yeah, at the same time, man, just the rate of change and things that are swirling around us. As human beings, we have limits to how much of this we can just internally process. And so I don't know. I guess I would say there are two big things I see in organizations that are making the difference right now. One is, to this point, actually designing for change. I think these days of mapping out stuff, very concretely of this is our 5-year plan for how we're going to do this. I think those days are gone. I think what we now need to be thinking is, okay, we've got a vision and a strategy we know we're headed towards, like our North Star. And now what we want to put in place is a set of capabilities and infrastructure that not only do what we need them to do today, but that one of the key characteristics we're optimizing for is adaptability and evolution and change. I think anytime if you're adopting systems or processes now that start to feel like a litmus test would be like, okay, if a year from now I had to change this, how painful would that be? If the answer is really painful, then you might be like, is there some other way I could do this that would give me a little bit more optionality? And so I think this whole idea of everything from how we architect systems to how we implement ongoing training and professional development, for our human resource. I think that's really important. And then the other thing I think that's changed, and I see the leaders in this space getting really good at, is this idea that each one of these little pieces of the organization is digitizing its own elements, right? It's not just about the big whole. It's even down in the the sort of the infinite niches of the business. They're steadily digitizing what they do and how they contribute that. And I think if you recognize that there's an opportunity to balance, on one hand, centralization of being able to connect these things together so they don't get isolated, in their own little pockets, but at the same time balance that with enough freedom and empowerment, that those little niches are able to very quickly iterate and adapt what they need to be able to execute on. And I think if you can, this is not an easy balance to manage, but I feel like this is the challenge, is if we can balance those two things, and we can do it in an environment where we're designing for change, and we can adapt as new things happen, as they will at a very likely fast rate. I kind of feel like that's the best you can do, and actually that's a lot. You don't even have to be perfect at that. You just have to be better at it than your competitors, and you can be a real powerhouse in this environment.
So one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot over the last, say, couple of years is the classic people, process, technology kind of triangle, and how once again lots and lots of evidence on this, right? That people are the long pole on that, right? One of the things that marketers stereotypically have been thought to really prize historically, like in the last, say, 10 or 15 years in particular, is orchestration. Do you see that? How do you feel about the idea that, culturally speaking, that priority, that value that they prize, or at least some of them prize, right, is the enemy of agility and the ability to deal with change?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that gets exactly to that heart of that centralization, decentralization trade-off that you're trying to balance, because I think this idea of perfect orchestration, it's really hard at scale. And I'm not even sure that if theoretically we achieved it in some nirvana state, that what do they call that? It's like the diminishing returns. Like as you asymptotically approach like perfect orchestration, how much net additional value is being created through that process? And yet it was seen for a long time as being kind of like one of the defining characteristics of competence as a marketer. Well, yeah, but okay, so if we got a spectrum where on one hand it's like complete chaos, nothing is coordinated whatsoever, and then on the other hand it's like perfectly orchestrated. Make no mistake, yeah, I'm in agreement. The total chaos one is, I believe the technical term is shit show, right? You don't want to do that. I mean, at the end of the day, I could sort of look at it through the lens of the customer. Like first and foremost, you don't want to come across as completely schizophrenic, disconnected in the way that customers engage with you. And customers engage with you now through a variety of different channels at a variety of different touch points, and so I think what you need at the orchestration level is enough cohesion across how those things are happening that the experience you're giving, it doesn't have to be optimized down to, we used the exact word here that we used in this, and we figured this color blue over here coordinate. But it has to be like, hey, we understand where you're at with the journey and your relationship with us, and we're representing that in a consistent and coherent way at these different points. I feel like that level of orchestration you have to do. If you don't do that, you're just pissing people off. It's like when you start to go further down that path of like, okay, not necessarily even for customer-driven interactions, but for marketer-driven interactions, how big is the scope of things that we want orchestrated, and how tightly orchestrated is it? I mean, customer journeys are like one of these things too, where it's right. I mean, it's actually probably a great metaphor for this. Is if you were to try and map your customer journey, it's an interesting question to ask. Okay, at what level of granularity can you get before it just becomes fiction? Right? Now you want to make it as granular as you can, because understanding these different stages of the customer journey let you make sure that you're able to serve what they're looking for at those stages, and you're able to measure, are we doing a good job at those different stages. But when you start to get down to a level of granularity of like, okay, and at this point they will go from this page over to this page, and then we expect in exactly 5 minutes they're going to want to tweet about this. Like there's a level where like you're just making this stuff up, like and I kind of feel that's another proxy for thinking about orchestration. Like yes, you want to orchestrate across the customer journey, but when it starts to get down to a level of like really minute interconnections between things, it's like it's a ton of work for not much value, I don't think.
So then let me ask you this. So if we kind of use product management and dev, right, as kind of a comparison, right, because that's where this really came from. So you have waterfall, right, and you have agile, and waterfall had governance built into it, and agile sort of kind of had some governance built into it, right? But what was prized was the reaction to change, right? And you could iterate. And yet, particularly when agile is applied to non-tangible things, right? So not a product, but more like let's call marketing a service for a second, okay? Things you can iterate and iterate and iterate in the middle of high velocity iteration, right? And then you can kind of like lose your bearings, right? Do you feel that MarTech is moving right now to help people manage this? And I'm intentionally being very, very general, right? Because you've just pointed out very eloquently, it kind of is there's some elasticity in this. But nevertheless, if you are a CFO, for example, you tend to see this more rigidly than maybe a sales leader would, right? And so there is this perception, not only in marketing but also in big transformation projects. So we do some work on that with different SIs, where how do you govern it? Where's the eye in the sky? So you were talking about the North Star, right?
Yep.
How do you see that kind of evolving now post-COVID?
Wow, there is a ton in that question. I think we could probably do like 3 podcast episodes just from that.
I accept.
So, I guess let me start with the first thing that came to mind, the way that setup was, which, because you kind of pressed one of my buttons, which I feel like there's been a lot of people over time who have tried to position agile methodologies as somehow being on the other end of the spectrum from this sort of like, you can be strategic and coordinated, or you can be agile. And I guess I disagree with the premise there. I feel like, a lot of the real agile methodologies out there, they were designed to have this balance where, yes, you have to have a feedback loop, you have to be able to iterate. But one of the things they do with those short feedback loops is there are control mechanisms at the start and the end of each feedback loop.
Absolutely.
And what should happen there is those should be the points where both A, you're getting a measurement reading, and you're also making sure that it aligns, with a higher level strategy and objective, because that is your guardrail to make sure that you're not just like iterating off into, some random space. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there is a real problem that a lot of people do agile and they don't put those control mechanisms in place. And I think it's fair to then say, like, okay, people who don't have those control mechanisms are at that risk of sort of iterating independent of the rest of
or where there's just so many simultaneous things that are iterating, including stuff that's not under your control.
That's true, but again, like I would still say, like, anything. There's almost another point, a very good one, of like, okay, yeah, what are the variables you're working with, and what are the variables outside of your control? But again, I kind of feel like the whole point of agile, in my opinion, is you want to have these short enough cycles that when variables change, whether they're the ones you controlled or frankly something externally, you have the mechanism to react. But if you don't have those guardrails of at the start of each of that cycle of like, okay, what we're actually going to do, how does this align up, again, with our core strategy, our core objectives, what's the measurement mechanism, so that when we get to the end of this, cycle, we can say, all right, is this working? Is it not working? And again, these things, we probably don't want to do a whole podcast on agile.
No, it's good. It's all good. So let me ask you this though. Do you feel like that? And so this is part of this is a totally unfair question because it's an overgeneralization, right? But I'm at a loss as how to frame it any other way. If we think about kind of the typical MarTech stack implementation, even among the top third, right, the best implementations, do you feel like that the feedback loops from a data standpoint are currently fast enough to handle that level of iteration, or do you feel like that needs to be enhanced?
Yeah, I mean, so my impression is, this isn't so much about would agile work or not work in, management of a stack. I think there's a broader, the related question is, are people actually thinking about stack management that way? And I think my opinion is most people are not. That these stacks are coming together probably at a lot of companies still in a mode that's incredibly ad hoc, or again, it's hard to generalize this stuff, but it's almost like, these stacks are large. We now know, if you ask someone what the size of their stack is, pretty much guarantee you they're underestimating it probably by a factor of 2. But that kind of speaks to the fact that these stacks are unevenly integrated. Even within a given stack, people
Right.
think oh yeah, I have my core CRM, here's the couple things I have to it. And then the universe of other things that start to get related to that, you could almost picture a solar system model where, okay, yeah, the planets closest to the sun there, have a certain, gravitational relationship with it that, as you get further and further out, into the Oort cloud of, the MarTech stack or whatnot, then the gravitational connection there is just not as strong. And so I think, people have gotten much better with the core of their stacks, I think. I think it's unusual for a company of any size to be completely uncoordinated with their, the top 3 to 5 major elements in their stack. But once you get beyond those top 3 to 5, I think a lot of people are still not actually managing that in an orchestrated, fully governed way.
Right. One of the things that we've noticed a lot in the last year is the time to insight, whether we're talking about data or analytics, right, is the really huge challenge that people are trying to grapple with, right? And that it's almost like by the time they get the information, the future is no longer the future, right? And so how do you, and then there's a lot of research that transcends this whole discrete topic, right? That says that the average human being, the unaided human brain, can't handle more than 4 variables, right? And so intuiting all this becomes all but impossible, right? It's sort of like the reason or the differences between flying a fighter plane in combat in World War II versus today, right? The variability is exponential, and then the speed is just many orders of magnitude greater, right? So everything's happening faster, and thus it becomes harder to do it without computer aids, right, in the cockpit. Yeah. So where do you see this going, right? If this is kind of the challenge that the MarTech universe has to help marketing people surmount, if you were going to look into your crystal ball in the next 5 to 10, right, or even sooner, right, because it's pretty urgent, how do you see that happening?
Yeah, well, I love your analogy there with the World War II to modern day fighter planes, and I think that's a very apt way of looking at it. Is this is where there's a tremendous opportunity, for AI, machine learning, for automation, but I think what gets really exciting is not can this all be done by a human, or can this be all entirely automated by a machine, but how do we find these sweet spots, where we're leaning in to leveraging the technology to deal with the curse of dimensionality, that's happening in the environment around us, but that for the way in which these things interconnect, because I think that's where a lot of machine learning and AI is still very challenged. Like within its domain, wow, man, can outthink, an army of us. But when you start trying to connect dots across domains, we're just not there yet, on an AI perspective.
Yeah, it's not polymathic.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think when you get that combination of the machine for simple things, just, responding immediately, but where things start to like be more of a set of signals that need to be raised for a human to be able to connect the dots, not just across them, but also across things like, oh, well, what does this mean for my organization? What does this mean for, like our strategy? It's like those combinations. I mean, we've barely begun to scratch, those possibilities. It's, so I'd say this next 10 years, I think that sort of, I've sometimes called this the harmonizing of human and machine.
Sure.
I think there's going to be a lot of innovation for that. Yeah, it's I'm bullish on it, but yeah, I'll be the first to acknowledge we are barely at the beginning of that here in April 2021. I had to check to what month is it? COVID land. I'm like,
Yeah, no,
it's
and
not
I
even
think
what day of the week is it. It's like, what month of the year is it?
Yeah, I think anyone watching this can empathize with that. So shifting gears here. So when you think about how you invest in value in your personal life, right? How do you think about that? I mean, because we're tempted to say, well, it's altruistic and all this kind of stuff, but even within not-for-profit type stuff, right? There's a trade-off, right? There's an opportunity cost, and so I know in my life, right? I'm always kind of saying, wow, I kind of have a choice on how I can spend my time here. Where what's going to be the best way for me to do that? How do you think about it? Because there's kind of a short, medium, and long horizon view of that, right? And again, that's the same as in business. But I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of carve out the family side of that very differently. Like pretty much everything else in my life outside of family, to be honest, all merges into all things Martech, which makes me one of the most boring people on the planet. If I think about friends I have who are not family and not Martech, I'm trying to think like if there's like if that's the empty set, because even friends I've had who weren't into Martech, I'm like, here, let me show you why this is so cool. So either they got excited too, or they're like, Scott, I'm just not gonna be your friend anymore. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like one of the I mentioned this earlier, like the thing with Chief Martech, I've gone out of my way to keep that as a labor of love. So, for instance, I do not keep an editorial schedule for my blog, which anyone who follows my blog will immediately say, yep, he definitely doesn't keep an editorial schedule. And I basically only write things when I feel like it. When I'm like, oh wow, that's really interesting. I'd like to write that up, and it's that basically the complete. I mean, I'm sure there's a bunch of people who are like professional thought leaders and content marketers who like hearing me say this are like, you're crazy, man. But for me, that's how I'm able to sustain that piece of my life. Is it's not a job. It's what I do for fun. And then for me, yeah, what's helped me sustain that is the fact that other people do get value out of that. Yeah, it's rewarding. I mean, I kind of feel like I get two bites of the apple. It's like I learn by writing this stuff and doing that stuff, and I find great joy in that. And then when I hear that other people found what I wrote about that useful and it helped them, I'm like, oh wow, that's great. And I don't know if I'd be able to do that if I didn't keep it in this bucket of like, okay, this is the labor of love. So anyway, that's it on everything except family. And for family, it's actually the Venn diagram does not intersect. I assure you, my wife does not want to hear anything about Martech. You know, her family, when I go
Yeah.
and visit them, like they don't want to hear anything about Martech, and that's perfectly fine by me.
Yeah, no, and I think I have a similar situation, right? I mean, and actually, it's one of the things that I've learned is that I talk so much about all this on a regular basis that when I'm not doing it, I really don't want to talk about it. You know, I used to be used to actually be professionally in politics, and one of the things that was true for every official or candidate or whatever that I was ever around and a part of was that they had pretty much at any one time two speeches, not three. They had two. This was, maybe in a campaign situation, it would go to three. And they would sort of iterate it a little bit for the circumstances of the audience that they were before and all, but it was still this two or three stock speeches. And by the end of the campaign or the period of time, whatever, right, they were so sick of talking about those three things that they just couldn't take it anymore, right? It was like, give me something new, right? And I do think that this kind of dovetails somewhat with what you were saying about keeping it joyful, keeping it fun for you, keeping it sort of avocational, right? Is that it's the only way to sustain it, right? As soon as you feel like that your whole being, and this is definitely true in politics, right? That your whole being kind of rides on the success of these speeches or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It sucks all the joy out of it.
Yeah.
There's only been probably two politicians in the 20th century. One is Bill Clinton and the other is LBJ, who sort of, for different reasons, transcended that framework, right? So I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for this. I think that we're going to really highlight the Martech part of this, because this has been a really, really interesting discussion about a lot of the issues that underpin where everybody is, right? That it isn't really about this part of Martech or that part of Martech or this sales tech or whatever, right? It's not really philosophical either. It's highly operational, right? But it's where people are circumstantially, given what we've just been through.
Cool. Well, I thank you so much for the the analogy there with the World War II fighter and modern day fighter plane. That's now stuck in my head.
Well, we're actually working on a video at Proof right now that uses that analogy because, among other things, it's very visually catching and high energy and all that kind of stuff, right? And it's kind of like, doesn't matter who you are, for that brief moment, you're going to say, "Wow, that's pretty cool." Right?
Yeah. No, congrats, man. Brilliantly. Just paints a picture in like 5 seconds. It's amazing.
Thank you so much. And if you would love to come back and talk about agile or anything else like that, right? You always are welcome. And I'll reach out to you, after a suitable period and say, hey, is that still burning a hole in your pocket, right? So
that sounds great. I'd be delighted to do this again with you.
Thanks so much. All right, guys, we have another great session with Scott Brinker, and look forward to next week. Thanks.